Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Stephen Darwall. He is the Andrew Downey Orrick Professor of Philosophy at Yale University. He is interested in moral philosophy and its history, and is focused on questions around the nature of moral obligation and well-being. And today we're going to focus mostly on the morality side of things. So, Dr. Darwall, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to everyone.
Thank you, Ricardo. Please just call me Steve.
Yeah, I will try. I will try.
Okay.
I can't promise because I'm used to the titles and the last name. So, but I
Yeah,
will
yeah,
try.
yeah.
Okay, so I mean, this is a very common question for me to pose to people who do work on moral philosophy and ethics. But do you think that morality is objective? And if so, what approach do you have to it? I mean, how do you think morality can be objective?
Yeah. Well, I do believe it's subjective. First, let me just distinguish between morality, as I understand it, and as I think the term morality in English has come, in Moralität, let's say, auf Deutsch, has come to be used since roughly the 17th century. On one hand, and ethics in the broadest sense that, for example, even the ancient Greeks were concerned with. So Socrates says that the question is how we should live. And that's a broad ethical question. It's not what I would call a question of morality, understood as conceptually connected to the idea of obligation, of what we owe to one another. And and so I argue, following, I didn't make this up. It's an idea I find in the history, starting roughly in the 17th century, that the idea of morality is conceptually connected to the idea of accountability. That what we're morally obligated to do is precisely what we are accountable for doing. To whom, we might ask? Well, a traditional answer was to God. But over time, I think that idea seemed uh, unsatisfactory. And the idea came to be that well, we're accountable to one another as, as we sometimes say, members of the moral community, where the moral community doesn't mean, let's say, any particular actual community constituted here on earth. It means something that we're just presupposing when we think about moral right and wrong, obligation, and so on. Okay, so once we've got this notion of morality in the narrower sense circumscribed, then the question is whether that can be objective. And
Okay.
I think it's actually conceptually necessary that it be objective. Here's why. Um, if what I'm morally obligated to do is what I'm accountable for doing, then it's got to be something I can know about. This is not true of all ethical notions. So think of Aristotle, for example, on the good, on Aristotle's thesis that the best life, eudaimonia, is a life of virtuous activity, and the virtues consist in certain specific traits of character, valuings of certain things, and so on. There's no assumption there that necessarily everybody is capable of being virtuous, and that everybody can know right off the bat, just by virtue of being subject to evaluation as being virtuous or vicious, what they need to do to be virtuous, and can, by virtue of that knowledge, do it. So it's a familiar view of Aristotle's, for example, that only the person of practical wisdom, the phronimos, knows what to do and will reliably do it and can reliably do it. It takes a lifetime of acculturation of traits of character, but it's part of the very idea of what you're morally obligated to do, that it's what you are accountable for doing. And it just seems to be a conceptual presupposition of that you can know about it, that you can do it because you know about it. So the deep thought here is that any moral agent, by which we mean any being who is subject to moral obligation, has to be capable of knowing what they're obligated to do and of doing what they're obligated to do by virtue of that very knowledge. Okay, so if there's such a thing as morality, then it's got to be objective. Well, is there such a thing as morality, you might ask? That's all very fine. I'll grant you the conceptual connection, but why think there is such a thing as morality? And this is where my argument comes in the second person standpoint. So what I argue in the second person standpoint is that whenever we make putatively legitimate claims or demands on others, or when they make them on us, we are necessarily presupposing a common second person standpoint from which we can hold ourselves and one another accountable. And if there's such a thing as second personal thought, and here you and I are right now engaging in it, so there must be such a thing as second personal thought. I mean, waiving certain traditional Cartesian objections about whether we know anything, but on the assumptions that we have to make when we converse, yeah, there is such a thing as morality, and it's objective.
Mm-hmm. That's a very interesting take. So, but I mean, if someone were to ask you in what circumstances, when, and to whom we are morally accountable, I mean, what would you say?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a different answer depending on whether we mean in principle or we mean in practice. So if we mean in principle, then we're always accountable to everyone and to ourselves as what I call representative moral persons. That is, as members of the moral community. Morality just is mutual accountability. And mutual accountability just is between beings who are capable of holding themselves and others accountable, who have what I call second personal competence. So all beings who have second personal competence have an assumed equal basic second personal authority. Okay, so in principle, we're accountable to anyone and everyone, not as the individual they are, but as a representative of, like us, of the moral community. But now what about in practice? When do I have the authority to say to you, for example, Ricardo, you just can't do that. You know, so I have this example that I use of someone stepping on another person's toe. So suppose I step on your toe. So can you say to me, Steve, or if you're uncomfortable saying Steve, Professor Darwall, take your foot off my foot? Well, I think, yes, you have the authority to say that. And the reason and it's not just that you have the in principle authority that any member of the moral community does. So, you know, any third party seeing it can think to themselves, Darwall should move his foot. And he's to blame if he doesn't move his foot without excuse. I mean, maybe his foot has gotten frozen somehow. I don't know if you're watching the French Open recently, but there was a protester, a climate protester, who glued her hand to the post that holds up the net in center court at the French Open. And of course, no longer she couldn't get it off. So if my foot were glued to your foot, okay, sorry, I can't get it off. Especially if somebody else glued it there. But on normal assumptions, I would be to blame. But it's not just that you, as a representative of the moral community, you as the person who has what we would call the right that I not step on your foot, and who therefore has what I call individual authority, has the in practice authority to complain, to object, to demand that I get off your foot, and to hold me accountable if I don't. So there's a difference between the in principle answer and the in practice answer. And the in practice answer can get really complicated. It can depend upon a whole lot of complicated contextual features, and there's just no general. I mean, I can give you a general framework for how you approach it, but I can't give you a general answer to it.
But I mean, that sort of framework and way of thinking can also help us solve some of the most complicated questions in ethics. Like, for example, if we think about Kant and these sort of imperatives, let's say, I mean, in cases where he would say, for example, that lying to someone to protect another person. I mean, he would probably say or admit that there are certain circumstances where it's morally legitimate or whatever to lie to someone to protect another person, for example, to protect a Jew from the Nazis, for example. He would probably grant that. But I mean, that sort of notion that there are fixed moral principles that apply across all circumstances, I mean, that's probably not that feasible, right?
Well, it depends what you mean by apply.
Okay.
Look, sometimes people, I think, confuse what we might call absolutism, which is the view that pretty simple principles like don't lie, those apply in all circumstances. Let's call that absolutism. Okay. But now you can deny absolutism and believe, for example, against Kant, that there are many different kinds of circumstances in which it would be justified, in fact, maybe even morally obligatory to lie.
No.
It depends on the circumstances of the case. But you don't then deny universality because you say in every case exactly like this, it would be wrong to lie. Or in every case like this, it would be permissible to lie. Or in every case exactly like this, it would be obligatory to lie.
Right.
So the circumstances need to be built in to the principles. The principles have to be sensitive to context in that way. But they can still be universal.
Yeah, but I think you get why I said that perhaps with that approach it's easier to deal with those questions, because if you are an absolutist, then I mean you get very easily into complicated situations, right?
Yeah, I agree.
So with that in mind, what would you say is moral obligation?
Well, moral obligation, as I understand it, again, is conceptually implicated to accountability. So I think there's a very simple conceptual formula that holds just as a matter of the concepts. And that is that an action is morally obligatory if and only if, necessarily if and only if, conceptually necessarily if and only if, it's an act of a kind that it would be blameworthy to fail to perform without excuse. So there's this conceptual connection between being obligatory and being such that you are accountable for performing it to the moral community. So that's what now, I can make that conceptual claim without making the metaphysical claim that that's what moral obligation is. And when I'm being cautious, I'll just make the conceptual claim. Hey, but today I'm feeling a little boisterous, let's say, so I'll make the metaphysical claim. Since you asked the metaphysical question, I think that what moral obligation is just it's being the case that an act is an act of a kind that there would be reason to blame. That is, it would be blameworthy, culpable, were you to fail to perform that act without excuse. So what's distinctive about this view, remarkable about this view, is that it connects a certain kind of assessment of an act, something that an agent can do, to there being reason to have certain reactive attitudes, in Strawson's terms. So a lot of the work that I do draws from this very important paper by Peter Strawson, P.F. Strawson, called Freedom and Resentment, where Strawson identified certain very distinctive attitudes that he called reactive attitudes. And they all have this second personal reciprocating structure. these days I'll distinguish between the deontic ones and the non-deontic ones. The deontic ones are attitudes like blame, resentment, and guilt. The non-deontic ones are attitudes like love, trust, and gratitude, and remorse as distinguished from guilt. And what's true of all of these attitudes, both the deontic and the non-deontic ones, is that they have what I call an RSVP, or a reciprocating structure. If I blame you for doing something, then I'm calling upon you to hold yourself accountable to me for doing it, to acknowledge that you did it and to take responsibility for having done it. I put myself in second personal relationship to you, and I call upon you to put yourself in second personal relationship to me. That's the deontic case. If you agree, you'll feel guilt. Guilt just is the very same attitude as blame, addressed not from the perspective of some other person, but to oneself, but from the shared perspective of a representative member of the moral community. But there are these other attitudes as well, like the reactive attitudes, the non-deontic cases like trust and love and gratitude and so on. And, if we have time at some point, maybe we can go into those. But going back to what you were interested in about the metaphysics of moral obligation, the interesting thing about this analysis, this metaphysical analysis of moral obligation, is that it connects it conceptually to there being reason to have certain deontic reactive attitudes. And that's where the action is, as it were. That there wouldn't be such a thing as moral obligation unless we had this way of responding to one another, unless we had this way of holding ourselves and others accountable. So that's really, when you get into the metaphysics of moral obligation, that's really what it turns on.
Mm-hmm. And what about moral duty? What is moral duty?
I think that's just another way of talking about moral obligation. I mean, we can use words any way we like. But the way philosophers tend to use the term moral duty, it's just synonymous with morally obligatory. So something is my morally, so here are the conceptual connections. If something's my moral duty, then it would be wrong for me not to do it. Similarly, if something is my moral obligation, then it would be wrong for me not to do it. I just think the two are synonyms. Now, we can use the word duty. Here's an example of, sometimes people use them differently. In a theory of justice, Rawls makes a distinction between what he calls the natural duty of justice and what he calls the obligation to be just. And he takes from Hart, H.L.A. Hart, the great philosopher of law of the mid 20th century at Oxford, who also goes back to Hobbes, this idea that obligations have to somehow be voluntarily assumed. Not true with duties. Fine. If you want to make that distinction, then we'll just say there are two kinds of obligations, or there are two kinds of, we can do it any way we like. We can either use the language the way they do, or we can use it the way most moral philosophers do. But ultimately, it comes down to the same thing.
Yes, but that's why I asked you that question, just to have a clarification, because there are a few moral philosophers here and there that sometimes use the two words differently, right. And also, just in normal parlance, let's say, sometimes people use them with different meanings, let's say. So.
Yeah. I just always find it helpful when you're talking to someone and you're having a discussion and you're debating some issue or discussing some issue, to try to figure out what they mean by their terms. Because there's just an enormous amount of talking past, of people saying, no. And when they actually they don't disagree at all. It just depends on, they're meaning different things by their terms.
Yeah, but sometimes that also happens with professional philosophers.
Oh, sometimes. It happens all the time.
Yeah, yeah. That's why I always try to always get to the definitions people are using to clarify things.
Yeah, well,
So, and what about the notion of respect? What is respect in the context of moral philosophy?
yeah, good. So, um, not my very first paper, but I suppose maybe my third paper was published in 1977 called Two Kinds of Respect. And I distinguish there between what I call recognition respect, uh, which, for example, is the notion we have in mind when we say that everybody is entitled to respect. What we mean is that they are entitled to recognition of their standing as persons, as equal moral persons. But there's another sense in which we can say that people deserve more or less respect depending on how they actually conduct themselves. And that's what I would call appraisal respect. You could call it moral esteem as well. Okay, so now going back to the ideas that we were just talking about, the idea of the moral community and everybody having an equal basic second personal authority, we can put that very same claim by saying that everybody is entitled to recognition, respect of their equal authority as a member of the moral community. Okay, but then, how we live our lives, uh, that's a different matter. And so people deserve more or less respect depending on whether they themselves have recognition respect for persons. If they do, then they deserve appraisal respect. If they don't, then they don't.
Mhm.
I just,
Uh,
I just,
uh,
I just
yeah,
inadvertently.
your video
Sorry,
went.
good.
Oh, yeah, you're
Sorry.
back now. Yeah,
Yeah, good. I
yeah,
somehow pushed a button.
yeah, yeah,
Unless it's
yeah. That happens. No problem. Did you have anything to add to your answer?
no, right. So, well, I'll say one other thing. So when I wrote that paper, I thought there was just one kind of recognition, respect for persons, the one we were just mentioning. And I came to realize several years ago that actually that there's another notion of recognition, respect for persons that's tied not to morality, but to honor culture.
Mm,
So what's an honor culture? An honor culture is a hierarchical, it's a status hierarchy where the people above look down on the people below and think that the people below are appropriately below. So, what is it that creates the honor culture? What does it depend upon? Well, it depends on patterns of deference. It depends upon the people above getting those below to defer to them. The deference is a kind of respect, it's a kind of recognition, it's a respect of their persona. So the term persona means something like the role that someone plays in a play. So you can think of, Shakespeare says in As You Like It, all the world's a stage.
mhm.
Well, that's true in a certain way. Um, there's a whole, all of status, all of social roles depends upon people recognizing these statuses and recognizing these roles. And individuals present themselves, they give a self-presentation, to use the term that Irving Goffman used in the presentation of self in everyday life. We're always presenting ourselves in certain roles, and people will either honor that or they won't. They'll either take it seriously and respect it, or they won't. And if they don't, then it's almost impossible for us to occupy the role. So there's this other kind of recognition respect that's involved in uh, what I call honor respect, that's involved in constructing social status and constructing honor hierarchies. And I have this paper called Respect as Honor and as Accountability, in which I make the distinction between these and show really some quite interesting differences between them. And they have a different relationship to truth, for example. So part of the idea of moral accountability is let's find out what's true about what you did. Okay, you give me an account, and so then we'll have a little trial. Okay, well, I didn't mean it. Oh, I'm sorry. So the whole idea, but there is no real truth or search for truth in an honor society. Really, what's going on is trying to get people to accept a certain narrative, a certain public narrative. So there's this great example that a guy named James Bowman, who wrote a book on honor, gives about in Camelot, in the Arthurian legends. There's Arthur, King Arthur, and there's Queen Guinevere, and there's Lancelot. And Lancelot is having an affair with Queen Guinevere. But nobody would accuse Lancelot of doing this, because what he would do is he would accuse them of being a liar. And then how would it be determined who's telling the truth? Not by an inquiry. It would be determined by a joust. So what determines the truth in honor cultures is some kind of test, some kind of honor test. So yeah, they're just these fascinating differences. So yeah, so really going back to your question, so these are two different kinds of recognition respect. It's moral recognition respect, which I argue is essentially second personal, that defines the moral relation, which defines the moral community, which is always being presupposed in the very idea of moral duty, moral obligation, and so on.
Mm-hmm. But don't you think that those, what you call narratives, is also something that people do quite often in societies that are not honor cultures? I mean, for example, in the context of being put before a judge, and I mean, having the lawyers there and so on. I mean, isn't it the case that people are trying to convince the judge or the jury that it's not their fault, or they're not morally responsible? And I mean, trying to come up with a convincing narrative for people to not hold them responsible.
Well, I think a lot here turns on what we mean by a narrative.
Okay.
So you said convincing narrative. Okay. Now there's this very interesting difference in English between convince and persuade.
Okay.
Convince is an essentially rational process. You can convince someone only through reasoning with them. Mm-hmm. Persuasion is another matter.
Okay.
You can use anything with persuasion: rhetoric, charm, intimidation, whatever it is. And the other thing is that when you convince somebody of something, that's obviously something that happens internally. They accept it themselves, and they have to accept it for reasons. They have to believe it's really true. Though it's true that the word persuasion has some of that connotation, really what's mattering with these public narratives is not whether people actually believe them, it's that they don't contest them. Now, I tend to think this is like maybe one of, if not the biggest problem with politics today, certainly in the United States, and I don't think this is in any way restricted to the United States, that, especially in the United States in the last 10 years, most especially since the election of Trump, and then with his losing the election, and then with that being denied by just an astounding percentage of people, members of the Republican Party. What's going on there is the attempt to control what's called the public narrative. The public narrative is the story that fills the public space. And, with Trump doesn't care about convincing anybody of anything. Trump is just trying to get airtime and to say things that other people are unable to get out of the public space. So now when you talk about a convincing narrative in a court of law, what's going on there is just an inquiry into the truth of something, and people are giving certain arguments. And it's more complex than just trying to find out the truth, because at least in the United States and many other jurisdictions, what matters is not just what's true, it's whether there are reasons to believe beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant did what they're charged with doing.
Mm-hmm.
And so the lawyer will use every tool they have available to try to put doubt in the jury's mind about it. And yes, they're not aiming at truth. I mean, they're trying to get their client off. But the process is aiming at truth, not merely at truth, because we have this beyond a reasonable doubt criterion, but it's aiming at what's the evidence, and that's an objective matter, and that's not a matter of narrative. That's a matter of trying to figure out what actually happened.
Mm-hmm.
So again, we can use the word narrative any way we like, but we just have to distinguish between speech, whose function is a public inquiry into the truth, versus speech whose function is to get people to defer to that version of events in the public dialogue, if there is even such a thing as dialogue in the public space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I get it. So, and since I introduced that example and the topic, I think, how do you look at the relationship between morality and the law?
Yeah. Well, obviously, excuse me, morality extends more broadly than the law. And there are questions about the nature of law and what is the law that are, as the legal positivists say, matters of positive social construction. So what the law is in the United States, for example, depends upon certain broadly social facts, and it's not a matter of morality. Of course, it's aiming at morality. It's purporting to aim at morality. Let's put it that way. So one way to put this is in terms of the difference between de facto and de jure authority. Legal positivists who want to affirm the distinction between law and morality, and hence between de facto authority and de jure authority, they nonetheless hold that the law purports to have de jure authority. So the law, to use an image that H.L.A. Hart used to use, purports to be something more than the gunman writ large. So Hart makes this distinction between being obliged and being obligated. The gunman can oblige you to do something by saying your money or your life, but he can't obligate you.
Mm-hmm.
But the law can obligate you. But it does so in this somewhat more complicated way. So it's different from the way morality obligates you. Morality obligates you by definition. The law doesn't obligate you by definition. It purports to obligate you. Okay, so there's this gap with the law that there doesn't exist with morality. But, if you follow, for example, Kant gives an argument along these lines. You don't have to be a Kantian to accept this argument that since there's no moral community here on earth, from the perspective of the moral community, we're obligated to constitute political communities that attempt to enforce, as it were, morality. Not all of morality, but because there are various kinds of practical reasons why that doesn't make sense, and that's inconsistent with the autonomy of persons and so forth and so on. But as part of morality, for example, that there are certain rights that people have, certain natural rights or human rights, as we call them. Okay, but those can be realized only within actual legal structures, actual political structures. So we need nation states, perhaps, and we certainly need things like the International Criminal Court, and we need courts like the kind that got constituted at Nuremberg after World War II. Since without what we normally mean by law, the moral law can't be realized.
So, since you mentioned rights, where would you place rights in the context of morality?
Yeah. So let's go back to that case of my foot being on your foot. Uh, and one of the things I think we need to distinguish is it's being wrong for me to put my foot on your foot. What we had from our discussion before is that if it's wrong, then I'm morally obligated not to do it. And if I'm morally obligated not to do it, then I'm accountable for not doing it. And so I'm subject to blame in principle, from anyone in the moral community if I put my foot on your foot without excuse. But then we said that, well, you also have a distinctive individual authority, not just as a member of the moral community, but you have an in practice authority to demand that I get my foot off your foot. That's the same thing as you're having the right to my getting my foot off your foot. Okay, so there are rights just in case there's such a thing as individual authority. And, you know, it takes a little argument, but I've made the argument. I think it can pretty easily be shown that if there's such a thing as morality, then there will also be such a thing as natural rights. You know, exactly what they are is a little complicated. But I mean, one that goes pretty quickly, comes into view pretty quickly, is the right to live one's own life. So we can be accountable to one another for what we do only if we have the space to make decisions and to live our lives. And so that gives you a certain kind of autonomy right there at the get-go. So I do think that there are moral rights. You know, some of these are claim rights. There are the rights to demand that people, for example, let you live your life. Some of them are permissions that, you know, we're not obligated, each of us, to save the world. We're obligated to do our part in saving the world, and most of us, almost all of us, don't do that, but we fall short of that. But still, there's this difference.
Mhm. But these moral rights you're talking about are not necessarily the same ones that are legally granted, right?
Right, right. What's actually legally granted will change from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And then we'll say that a society is more or less just to the extent that people are being accorded their moral rights. So, you know, some of the greatest you know, we talk a lot about the depressing situation in the world today, and it is depressing in many different ways.
Yeah.
On the other hand, you know, there's the arc of history is long, and it bends to justice, as Dr. King said.
Yeah.
And so, you know, in my lifetime, if I think, for example, about the civil rights movement, the rights of Black Americans,
The sexual minorities.
transgender rights now, which are incredibly contested in the United States at the current moment. But still, you know, there are setbacks. Goodness knows there are setbacks. We have some terrible setbacks right now in the United States. But I'm pretty confident that over time, they will keep going that way.
Mm-hmm.
But but you were saying there's a difference between the two, and there certainly is a difference between the two.
Mm-hmm. And I think that another concept that is at least to some extent connected to rights, at least some of them, of course, is of the concept of dignity. So from a moral perspective, what is dignity, or what is the dignity of a person?
The word dignity can mean different things. We could talk about someone losing their dignity or not behaving in a dignified manner, or we can also talk about the dignity of persons or of human beings, such that everybody has a dignity. That's roughly the distinction between recognition, respect, and appraisal respect that I was talking before.
Yeah.
Respect for someone as a person is a respect for their dignity. Now, how do I understand that notion? Well, that if it's true, as I argue, that all beings who are second personally competent, that is, who have the capacity to hold themselves and others accountable in reciprocal relations of mutual accountability, have a shared, as I call it, second personal authority. That's either that's just what dignity is, or dignity is some underlying value from which this authority springs. And I've written a couple of things about dignity that sort of make that point. So dignity is a concept that's, on the one hand, it's extremely important. On the other hand, it's often under attack as being an empty concept. I think the necessary content that it has to have is this idea of second personal authority, the authority to hold one another mutually accountable from a shared perspective. Rawls put this by saying being a self-originating source of valid claims. And for me, that's what dignity is.
Mm-hmm. So I would like to go back now in the last part of this interview to the concept of second person standpoint, and then talk a little bit about second person morality and related questions. So tell us a little bit more about what is the second person standpoint. You told us a bit about it, but to be more specific, what are the sort of psychological abilities that we should associate with them? I mean, what are the abilities that people, I mean, eventually other animals would have to be able to experience mentally the second person standpoint?
Yeah. Well, actually, this evolutionary question and this ethological question about human beings and other animals, we are, of course, animals, but
yeah, sure.
There's a wonderful book by a man named Michael Tomasello, who is a developmental psychologist, who's done really important work on child psychology, but also on the psychology of other animals, the great apes in particular. And he's written a number of things, but a book that I think is especially important is one that's called A Natural History of Human Morality. Mm-hmm. And Tomasello argues that human beings have certain distinctive capacities that no other animal has that enable us to cooperate. So there are these game theory cases. There's one called Stag Hunt, and there's Prisoner's Dilemma and so on. Let's take Prisoner's Dilemma. So Prisoner's Dilemma, the interesting thing about it is that from the standpoint of rational choice, it looks like people who pursue their own interests, who maximize their own preference satisfaction, in these kinds of situations are doomed to be in mutually disadvantageous, to get mutually disadvantageous outcomes. Roughly, the idea is if you can't cooperate, you can't get the benefits of cooperation. There are huge benefits of cooperation. But what is cooperation? Cooperation is not merely strategic pursuit of self-interest. There are times where happily, or because of other kinds of social incentives and so on, there are reasons of self-interest for us to do things that we would do cooperatively if we could cooperate. But sometimes that's not true. Often it's not true. And we actually need to cooperate. So really the question is, what do you need to be able to do to cooperate? And what you have to, and Tomasello's thought is, what you have to do to, well, I guess this thought I have as well, what you have to be able to do to cooperate is to be able to engage in second personal thought. Where, like right now, you and I, let's say, suppose we were trying to solve some kind of practical problem, like how long the interview would go on or something like that. will cooperate only if we treat each other as an equal partner in our reasoning and give to each other the very same authority in our deliberations that we want for ourselves. So there's this famous saying of Abraham Lincoln, as I would not be a slave, so I will not be a slave owner. So that's golden rule reasoning. And it's like Kantian categorical imperative reasoning. I would do this only if I could will that everybody do this.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. That's the kind of thinking that human beings can do and naturally do unless they're defending themselves in all kinds of ways. And that no other species seems to be able to do. So what does it take to do that? Well, it takes, among other things, empathy. Empathy understood in a distinctive way, not as, for example, emotional contagion, which other animals have all over the place, but a certain kind of, I put myself in your position to view myself from your perspective. You put yourself in my position to view yourself from my perspective. And then we both try to occupy some impartial perspective
Mm-hmm.
between both of us that takes us both into account. And then we reason from that perspective. So that's what we could call second personal reasoning. So it requires empathy. It requires the capacity for reactive attitudes. That is the capacity to hold oneself and to hold others to things that it makes sense to hold people to from this perspective. And so Tomasello argues that he gives actually a little evolutionary theory about how this capacity arose
Mm-hmm.
among our hunter-gatherer, mostly our gatherer ancestors, who needed to engage in what he calls obligate collaborative foraging. And they could do that only if they could do this together. And other species don't really do that. So when there's a hunt of chimpanzees, each chimpanzee is in the end out for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, now, not all human beings have this by default. Notoriously, psychopaths don't have it. So it's certainly not a trivial thing, but it's a very important human capacity.
Well, in the case of psychopaths, they are also able to attribute mental states to other people, but in that case, they use that to their advantage, right?
Exactly. Right. So that you've made a very important point, which is that it's not that only human beings can attribute mental states. There's all kinds of experimental evidence that other animals can do that.
Mm-hmm.
So they're just really interesting examples of other, chimpanzees and other kinds of from this general category being able to tell what the experimenter wants them to do, or the experimenter will drop something and they'll sort of figure out, oh, he wants it, so they'll reach it and give it back to him. Yeah. So and you're right that the psychopath is certainly capable of that and uses it to their advantage.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah, it's basically that distinction that some psychologists, notably Paul Bloom, make between cognitive empathy and emotional empathy. I mean, psychopaths have cognitive empathy, but they don't really feel what other people feel.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So, and I mean, how do we move from a second person morality to a universal morality? Because that's another big step, right?
Yeah. Yeah, this is actually one of the things that is evident in Tomasello's work. So in that book I mentioned, he has a chapter that's called Second Personal Morality. And that's sort of person on person.
It's dyadic.
Dyadic. It's dyadic, right. So how do we get from the dyadic case to larger societies and to the idea of the moral community as a whole? And what I argue, and Tomasello doesn't accept this, but what I think is true, is that even in the two-person case, we're already presupposing the universal. We're already presupposing the idea of the moral community. Here's the thought. Let's suppose, you and I are just trying to figure something out about what we should do. So I'll say, well, this is what Ricardo thinks, this is what I think. But still, it'll be subject not just to what we actually think, but to what we should think. And what we should think can't be assessed from the other person's standpoint or from your standpoint. We're presupposing some impartial standpoint. So I think even in the two-person case, we're already presupposing this idea of the impartial second personal perspective, which is roughly the perspective of the moral community. I'm not saying that our hunter-gatherer ancestors had this idea. I'm saying that for ideas they did have, those ideas were incomplete in certain ways that require completion in that way. So always already the moral community and morality is in the background.
Mm-hmm. So since you brought Michael Tomasello to the table, and I also mentioned Paul Bloom, for example, how do you look at the relationship between moral philosophy and moral psychology?
Yeah. Well, there's a huge difference on the one hand, but morality can't be entirely independent of moral psychology for some of the reasons we've already talked about. So what's the difference? Well, the difference is that moral philosophy is normative and moral psychology is not normative.
It's descriptive, right?
Yeah, it's descriptive, right. Mm-hmm. So it's trying to understand, as a matter of empirical science, our actual psychology. Mm-hmm. Morality, so that's an is. Morality is an ought, right? Okay, so that's the big difference.
So in that case, you agree with people like Hume, when they say that we can't, this is a simplification, but we can't derive an ought from an is.
Yeah, I agree with that. Mm-hmm. I agree with that. It's a complicated matter, and there are lots of arguments for why we shouldn't agree with that, but I'm prepared to take them on. I'm pretty sure there's got to be that. Anyway. But now morality, precisely because of this connection to mutual accountability, is presupposing a certain kind of psychological structure. Mm-hmm. Now, when you think about it, this is always true, right? So even just think about the idea of rational choice or there being reasons. There can be such a thing as rational choice only for beings who are capable of rational choice, and that'll require certain psychological capacities. Mm-hmm. What's interesting about morality is it requires certain distinctive psychological capacities, namely these second personal ones. And these are things that, on the one hand, you can understand them philosophically, because if I'm right about morality, and if we are moral agents, then we just have to have these capacities. But maybe we don't. Maybe we're just fooling ourselves. So then we do the psychology to see whether we do. And it turns out we do. That is, that Tomasello not only is arguing that we do, but that it's distinctive of our species. And he's giving an evolutionary argument for why we acquired them. And so in a certain way, I've always thought of my moral philosophy as not quite being hostage to moral psychology, but as giving out certain promissory checks that you need to do the psychology to see whether or not those checks could be cashed. So in the second person standpoint, I have a chapter called The Psychology of the Second Person that goes through a lot of empirical psychology at the time. The book was published in 2006, and tries to show how various findings that have emerged from experimental psychology confirm the idea that we are second personal moral agents.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, even if we can't really derive oughts from ises, I guess that you would agree that moral philosophy still should be informed by moral psychology. I mean, we have to know what kind of animal we're dealing with to develop a moral philosophy, right? I would imagine that if there were any chimp moral philosophers, they would probably develop a moral philosophy that would be very different from ours, right?
Like, well, so if I'm right, they can develop an ethics, but they can't develop a moral philosophy.
Oh, okay.
Or a morality.
Okay. So, one last question, I think. At the beginning, you told us about your morality as accountability take, let's say.
Yeah.
Do you think that it can also be applied in the context of moral psychology? Do you think it can be explored scientifically?
Well, I mean, I think roughly what we were just talking about. That is, I think that obviously our moral psychology can be explored scientifically, and though morality is not the same thing as our moral psychology, nonetheless, it makes certain assumptions about our moral psychology, and then we have to look to the actual empirical science to see whether or not those things hold.
Mm-hmm. Very well. So, before we go, would you like to mention where people can find your work on the internet?
Well, if you just Google Stephen Darwall with quotes, then pretty much all of it shows up somewhere or other. There's something called Phil Papers, which is a database of everything of mine shows up there. There are a number of videos of things I've done that show up. And if anybody's interested, they can always just write me.
Okay, great. I will be leaving some links to that in the description box of the interview. And
Cool.
Steve, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show, and it's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
Well, it's been a great pleasure for me as well, Ricardo. Thank you so much.
Oh,
Thank you so much.
hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. To keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. Any amount, even $1 per month, would already be a great help. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like, and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litske and Blanchett Perga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunder, Ricardo Vladimiro, Greg Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wissel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolfkin, Tim Hollis, Henrik Alenia, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Neuberger Goldstein, Dan Demetriou, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Colombo, Jorge Spinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Ugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Al Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librand, Oslan Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Eden Solon, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londonio Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hellman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmides, Saima Afzal, Adrian Yagi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Pons Cortez, Ursula Litske, Denise Cook, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, and Max Belby. My producers Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Staffiniak, Ian Gilligan, Luís Caetano, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardas France, Thomas Trumbull, and Nuno Welder. And my executive producers Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.